and then show us one of the episodes and narrate it, and then we can have a Q&A with him afterwards. So Laurent, can I invite you up? Laurent is also a full board member of the FCCT, so all the good people are.
Thank you to all of you for attending this evening. If I may start with a thought to Eric Seldin, that was the sad news were mentioned by Dominic, and we were on the board on the same 2 years together some over 10 years ago, and he was a very, very, very good videographer, and I miss him. So what you're going to see tonight is, I used to be director of programs and organized many programs in this room, but it's the first time I'm the one speaking from this spot. And what you're going to see is a work I've done over the past 6-7 years. The idea came to me in 2011 during the big floods. Before that, for many years, I'd been a financial reporter. I used to be with Bloomberg, before that with Dow Jones, before that with another agency gone by now called Night Reader Financial News. And so I covered Thailand's economy for years and years. And then in 2007, I quit journalism to set up my own company that does, among other things, video productions. And then in 2011, when the floods hit Thailand, in the midst of all the bad news about Don Mueang flooded, here flooded, and that flooded, there was kind of something that inspired me. 2 headlines. The first one was the world computer market affected, the hard disk supply affected by the floods in Thailand, because Thailand has huge hard disk facilities. I visited one in which 32,000 people are making hard disk, okay? And another one was Thailand's auto industry, top 10 in terms of exports in the past few years, is so big that some parts were missing in some markets because those parts were made in Thailand. And I say, hey, there's something here. First time I came to this country in 1978, 40 years ago, basic electronic products, or it's not really electronic in those days, it was still a lot of electric, or cameras, or basic things, you could not really find easily in Thailand. You had to go to Hong Kong, Singapore, Tokyo to buy things. And today, I mean in 2011, the world can't find hard disks because they are made in Thailand. I want to tell that story. I want to know what happened in those 30-odd years since my first trip here. And so I started to look for, if I want to tell that story, I long wanted to do a documentary. I said, I'm going to do a documentary about that, how Thailand came from somewhere in the past to today in terms of economic development. And I look back and I say, where do I start? Do I start with the Eastern Seaboard in the 80s? Do I start with the first national economic development plan inspired by the World Bank in the late 50s, early 60s? Do I go back to Rama V? Do I go back to where? And I talked to a lot of people, all those economists and knowledgeable people I know, and the only answer possible was no. Everything started with the Bowring Treaty. That's the real start, if you want to go to the root of the thing. And then I decided to say, okay, to do a documentary going from Bowring Treaty to today. And then later on, I decided, hey, what about doing a 5th episode on where are we going to, where are we going from here? So there are 5 episodes. So bear with me, it's 5 episodes of 55 minutes each. I thought about it, conceived it, wrote the script, mostly in Thai, for 5 years. And then it took about 18 months to produce. Used archives from Thailand and many countries around the world, and interviewed 21 people, all top people, former Prime Minister An Panirachun, the late and very missed already former Secretary General of ASEAN, Dr. Surin, amazing man, businessman, economists, historians, and I all I'd written the script, and then I asked them questions, and then I threw away most of my script and basically quoted as many of their answers as possible. And I had a team of 3 people helping me finding images that would match their words. So I won't go any further at this point. What you're going to see is a bit special because this documentary has been shown in Thai on 2 Thai channels already, Thai PBS first, and then it was replayed on True Vision's True Pluk Panya, which is an educational channel. And 1 more channel is supposed to show it very soon. And after that, we will release the thing on YouTube. But it's all in Thai, but 4 foreigners speaking in English. Philip Bowring, a relative of Sir John, used to be editor of the Firestone Economic Review. Andrew Sheng, a fantastic world-class level banker who knows so many things. And Aral Link of Big Green Company, and David Lyman, many of you probably know, that larger-than-life, 82-year-old young man who has been here since the 50s in his living history of Western involvement in Thailand. But 17 others people I interviewed are all Thai. So former prime minister, former central banker, economist, businessmen like Kuntanin from CP, bankers. And all this was made possible by the sponsor I got to make this happen, Siam Commercial Bank, and they were great. They never intervened in the content I put. I interviewed who I wanted, I put the images I wanted, I shot whatever I wanted, and they just supported the project as an educational project. So I'm going to show you, I don't think anyone would stand 5 episodes in one go, even if, how they call it, watching in the days of Netflix, you watch many episodes in one day, but here 1 episode will do. I will show you the first episode, and like in the old days of when my grandfather was doing silent short movies, you will have live dubbing, or they had piano maybe in those days, in the 1920s. I'm going to dub myself, if I may say, in English, because the thing is in Thai, but I will make sure I don't cover the English quotes, because Philip Bowring, David Lyman, Harold Link, and Andrew Sheng all give very, very powerful contributions to this thing. And this is just episode 1, so I divided the period in 40 years. 160 years divided by 4, but it's not exactly 40 years each episode. I've been through 40 of the 160 years, so I try to base on that and then go back. And the episode about the future. But what you will see goes basically from 1855 to 1911, and you will see, watching the movie and listening to my dubbing, which I hope will be up to the level. What I wrote it is, translating yourself is tricky. I hope you enjoy it. If I see all of you going back home, I will know that we did not succeed, but hope you enjoyed the show. And after that, I'm ready to take any question or comments that you may have. So if Kun Rung can now start the show. I forgot to give you the title. The thing is called, in English, Thailand An Economy on the Path of Globalization. In Thai, it's called วิวัฒนาการเศรษฐกิจไทยบนเส้นทางโลกาภิวัตน์ Here I'm just saying that as an intro that it's a disclaimer. I hope this leads people to be excited about economic history to better understand the future.
กรุงเทพมหานครได้เติบโตขยายตัวอย่างต่อเนื่องจนมีประชากรถึง10 ล้านคนในปัจจุบันเป็นเมืองหลวงที่มีวิวัฒนาการไม่หยุดนิ่งตลอดเวลาและพัฒนาการที่ไม่หยุดยั้งนี้เองที่ผลักดันให้กรุงเทพเป็นศูนย์กลางทางเศรษฐกิจของภูมิภาคและเป็นศูนย์กลางของเศรษฐกิจที่สำคัญ ในยุคโลกาภิวัตน์ก็ว่าได้รูปแบบการเดินทางของผู้คนเปลี่ยนแปลง
The way people have been traveling in
ตั้งแต่การ
Bangkok
ก่อตั้งกรุงเทพ
and life in Bangkok
เป็น
has
เมืองหลวงเมื่อกว่า
changed
200 ปีก่อน
tremendously since
นี่เป็น
those
หนึ่งใน
days.
ปัจจัยสำคัญที่กระตุ้นให้ผู้คนจากทั่วทุกมุมโลก
And
เดินทางมา
more
เยือน
and
ม
more
หานคร
foreigners
ข
are
องไท
living
ย
here,
ปี
and
ละ
the
หลาย
reason
ล้าน
is
คนทุกวันนี้
คนไทยเริ่มเปลี่ยนตัวเองจากมนุษย์น้ำมาเป็นมนุษย์บกคือในช่วงก่อน
what he's saying is
ประ
that
เทศอย่างจริงจัง
Thais were
คนในกรุงเทพเกือบทั้งหมด
people living on the water
อยู่บนแม่น้ำ
until the
เจ้าพระยา
1850s,
อยู่บริเวณ
and
แพ
the
ในกรุงเทพก็คือเรือนแพบนแม่น้ำ
slowly
เจ้าพระ
they
ยา
got out of living on the water to live on the land because of the changes that happened in those years. In those years, all the Westerners coming to Thailand will paint or take pictures or describe Bangkok as a city on
ใน
stilts.
ช่วง 160 ปีที่ผ่านมาโฉมหน้าของประเทศไทยได้พลิกผันจากเศรษฐกิจที่พึ่งพาเกษตรกรรมเป็นหลัก
Those
มาสู่การเป็นประ
160
เทศ
years
ผู้นำ
have
ด้าน
seen
การส่งออก
Thailand's
สินค้าเกษ
economy
ตรของโลก
changing
รวมถึง
tremendously
สินค้า
from
อุ
a
ตสาหกรร
purely
มหลายประเภท
agricultural
เป็นหนึ่งในศูน
society
ย์รวมการลงทุนในระดับภูมิภาค
to an
และเป็นแหล่ง
investment
ท่องเที่ยว
center,
สำคัญของ
tourism
โลก
center,
พัฒนา
and
การทาง
changes
เศรษฐ
in
กิจ
many
ของไทย
areas.
ในยุคต้นรัตนโกสินทร์ไม่ได้เกิดขึ้นตามธรรมชาติ
Those
แต่เป็นผล
changes
จาก
did
แรง
not
กดดันของ
come
ชาติตะวันตก
by
ที่แผ่อิทธิ
themselves,
พล
but
เข้ามายัง
because
ซีกโล
of
กนี้อย่างรวดเร็ว
global trends,
ส่งผลกระทบอย่างมาก
the
ต่อ
Western
โครงสร้างเศรษฐกิจ
colonization in the
และสังคม
region.
ในยุคนั้นในรัชสมัยของพระบาทสมเด็จพระจอมเกล้าเจ้าอยู่หัว
And
รัช
one
กาล
key
ที่
event
4
under the
ได้
reign
มี
of
การลง
Rama
นามในหนังสือ
IV
สัญญาทางพระราชมัยตรีระห
was
ว่างประเทศอังกฤษ
the Amity
และประเทศ
Treaty
สยาม
signed between Siam
ซึ่ง
and
ถือเป็น
the
บทหมาย
United
สำคัญ
Kingdom.
ในการเปิดประเทศและระบบเศรษฐกิจไทยที่ปูรากฐานสู่การพัฒนาทางเศรษ
And
ฐ
that
กิจ
was
ในเว
been
ลา
the
ต่อ
start
มา
of development since
ที่สัญ
then.
ญาเบลลิงที่ได้เซ็นระหว่างอังกฤษไทยในปี 2398 ถือได้ว่าเป็นกุญแจดอกสำคัญ
The
ที่นำไป
treaty in
สู่การเปิดประเทศไทย
1855 is really
ตัวอย่างยิ่ง
the key
การเปิด
opener
การค้า
to
เสรี
modernization,
ก็เลยทำให้การ
free
ค้าขาย
trade,
ระหว่างไทยกับต่างประเทศเนี่ย
and
มีความ
relations
คล่องตัว
between Thailand and the rest of the
ขยายตัว
world.
มากมายในช่วงเวลาหลังจากนั้น
The Bowring Treaty of 1855 indeed was a visionary agreement of King Mongkut, even though people thought it was maybe imperial decree from the British on to the Siamese, because it opened Thailand to all kinds of business opportunities for the future.
ทั้งนี้ด้วยพระปรีชาของพระมหากษัตริย์ที่ทรงตัดสินพระไทยดำเนินการในด้านต่าง
All
ๆ
this
เพื่อตอบ
goes
สนอง
down
ต่อ
to
แรงกดดัน
the
จากภายนอกประเทศ
vision
ทำให้สยามสามารถดำรง
of
ความเป็นเอ
the
กรา
Thai
ชเอาไว้
kings,
ได้
especially King
พร้อม
Rama
ๆกับ
IV
การพั
and
ฒนา
Rama
เศรษฐกิจ
V
ให้เติบโตอย่าง
to
มั่นคง
take
ต่อไป
Thailand basically on the path of
The Bowring
modernization.
Treaty was accepted, by Queen Victoria as a treaty between equals, between equal, monarchs. And it's very important in the way that countries see things. If to be treated as an equal, Siam, as a result, avoided being colonized, unlike Burma and Myanmar.
สังคมไทยประชาชนส่วนใหญ่ก็เรียกว่าเป็นพวกอนุรักษ์นิยมเนี่ย
The Thai society, that's
แต่
Prime Minister
สิ่ง
Anand
ที่ดีงาม
says,
ใน
Thai
สัง
society
ค
is
มไท
very
ย
conservative,
ในที่เรียกว่า
but it's also a society where people are very pragmatic.
สยามในอดีต
And
เนี่ย
the king, here mainly Rama IV and Rama V, have been leaders in having that pragmatic vision of things, not letting
คนไทยส่วนใหญ่
ideologies dominate
เป็นชน
them.
ชาติที่ผมต้องเรียกว่า pragmatic ก็หมายความว่าคน
And
ไทย
that's
เนี่ย
what
ไม่
helped
ได้
Thailand
ยึด
get
อยู่กับ
through
ปรัช
all
ญา
the changes
ความคิด
since then,
หรื
the
อยึดอยู่กับ
crisis,
หลักการของ
the
ไม่
Cold
คำนึง
War,
ถึง
or
ผล
anything
ของการ
else
ปฏิบัติ
that came by.
นั้นคนไทยส่วนใหญ่รวมทั้งพระเจ้าอยู่หัวในการที่ท่านทรงสามารถทำให้ประเทศไทยนี่อยู่รอดพ้นจากการคุกคามของระบบ
Helped Thailand not being
การเมือง
colonized.
ระหว่างประเทศของประเทศตะวันตกระบบอาณานิคมเนี่ยเพราะว่าท่านเป็นผู้ที่มองถึงเรื่องภาคปฏิบัติผลทางด้านปฏิบัติมากกว่าก็หมายความว่า
The kings
พ
were
ร้อมที่จะ
pragmatic.
อรุ่มรวย พร้อมที่จะประนีประนอม พร้อมที่จะแลกเปลี่ยนผลประโยชน์ซึ่งกัน
Ready
และ
to
กัน
negotiate.
เป็นอุปนิสัยที่สำคัญที่ทำให้เรา
That's the
สามารถ
letter of
ฝันฝ่าอุปสรรคในเรื่องของระบบ
the
อาณานิคม
second king under Rama IV
ฝัน
to
ฝ่าอุป
Sultan
สรรคใน
Bowring.
เรื่องของภัยคอมมิวนิสต์ฝันฝ่าอุปสรรคในเรื่องของการขึ้นการลงของสภาวะเศรษฐกิจสภาวะการคลัง
So, there was a basis in Siam, which had been built by Mongkut and one or two other members of the royal family, on which the idea of modernization could be built. There was an understanding that yes, they had different interests and points of view, but nonetheless there were some overriding things of which they could agree, and that there was a level of trust which was quite important.
The second letter was a letter by King Rama IV to Sir John Bowring. And here we just summarize the contact between Siam and the rest of the world. Had been active in Ayutthaya, then there was some drawbacks, and then restarted with the Chakri dynasty, contacting with the Chinese. And this is mostly images from temples where they have all those nice mural paintings describing things in the Rama III. But Siam restarted talking to the West in the 1820s, talking to, for example, there was a treaty with UK, first treaty with the UK called the Bowring Treaty, but that was mostly about borders definitions, not much about trade. And there was also an early treaty with the US. I see the MChem here, so I should mention that. And the British, with the first Bowring Treaty, really looked to define their empire. And what Dr. Sorin here is saying is that in the early time the Westerners came, it really they brought a lot of things. The maps were done by the foreigners, so it was really about definition of territory. The concept of map, the concept of country, territory really was born then. So the Bowring Treaty was mostly about borders, so it didn't really impact the economy, which was still very, at an early stage, village economy mostly. And there was some trade with foreign countries, like textile with India and porcelain with China. And the main export product from Thailand in those days were some rare woods, tin, and a few things like that. But it was still very basic trade. But the Bowring Treaty and all the similar treaties that followed with other countries really changed the shape of trade of Siam. And the treaty itself was not just a result of colonization and Westerners coming around here, but behind it, of course, there was the Industrial Revolution that had started in Europe before that. So now we go to describing who Sir John Bowring was. And so he was a very clever politician and trader and many things in the UK. And then he was sent to Asia, first as a consul in Canton, Guangzhou nowadays, and then governor of Hong Kong, and assigned to deal in trade issues with three countries: Cochin China, the name back then for Vietnam, Japan, and Siam. Cochin China refused to talk to him, and we know what happened there. And Japan, the Americans got there first, and so his big achievement was reaching trade with Siam.
And cheaper food prices, which meant getting rid of protection for farmers and encouraging free trade, so that Britain in return would import food but would export manufactures. So that was his theme, and that was what he sort of fought for when he did all these missions overseas, and so that really fitted with when he went to Asia at a time when Britain was trying to develop trade with countries which were essentially closed to the outside world, and so that was how he became involved with Siam.
So the main content of the treaty was really to define the tax rates on, and it was that flat rate basically on trade of 3%, which became the name of the old custom house you can see near the Oriental, which is dubbed in Thai the 3% tax house.
And besides the tax rate, really it's free trade. For example, before that treaty, it was forbidden to export rice.
Landmark treaty because it established the ability of then British nationals to set up businesses in Thailand to be able to import and export relatively free of taxes, which had been a burden from before. And it was used as the model treaty, if you will, for a number of other foreign nations that followed, and setting up similar treaties, opening up Thailand, if you will, to Western trade. Everything grew from there.
Sir John Bowring ยืนยันว่าการให้ความ
So that was the list of all the countries that had similar treaties to the Bowring Treaty after that, starting from US 1 year later.
In progress, and that trade and free movement of ideas brought progress.
And of course, nowadays, free trade is the normal way of doing business, but at that time it was kind of revolutionary.
พระบาทสมเด็จพระจอมเกล้าเจ้าอยู่หัวรัชกาลที่ 4 ทรงตระหนักดีถึงความพยายามของอังกฤษที่ผลักดันเรื่องการค้าเสรีแต่ก็ทรงวินิจฉัยว่าจะสามารถใช้อังกฤษเพื่อเสริมสร้างความแข็งแกร่งให้แก่สยาม
And Laurent Malespine knew the real intent of the British, but he thought that dealing through this treaty with the United Kingdom, it will strengthen Siam and its position in the world, which is what happened. And if you look around the same years, what happened to Japan, Commodore Perry shutting the port of Tokyo, or things like that, you realize that by being pragmatic and negotiating, King Rama IV really saved Thailand from colonization. That's very old images of Japan when Japan was fairly poor, and it's quite interesting images that I found in archives. And look at China that got invaded in many ways, all the key ports taken by the British or all the other powers. So Sam managed to get through that.
Burma was a colony, Malaya was a colony, and the whole of Indochina, was a colony. I guess, China was lucky not to have been swallowed up, unlike India. But Thailand was very special because it was geopolitically very strategic, and it managed to balance between the French, the British, and the Dutch, colonial aspirations, put it this way. That is of great contribution of the Thai monarchy in balancing these very difficult interests to keep Thai independent.
ตั้งข้อสังเกตว่าประเทศไทย globalized.
This is Professor Amar Siamwala, a great economist, and he says, basically from that point on, Thailand's economy has been globalized. Never really managed to go back. Even some periods you had people attempting. But once the process started, Thailand was integrated in the world trade. And if you look at one explanation for that is that Bangkok, the capital, was near the sea, very in contact with foreigners. When Burma got colonized and went kind of backward compared to Siam, because the capital was far away from the land and always afraid of foreigners, and then ended up swallowed up by the British.
อันนี้เป็นผมคิดว่าเป็นส่วนสำคัญ
เมื่อชาติตะวันตกทั้งหลายแข่งกันแผ่อิทธิพลเข้ามาในสยามจึงเป็นเรื่องปกติที่แต่ละชาติจะแนะให้สยามพัฒนาเศรษฐกิจตามแนวทางของชาติตนซึ่งทำให้สยาม
From that point on, all the Western powers started to have influence in Thailand, in Siam, and try to influence Thailand, going their own ways in the areas where they were strong. The late Dr. Surin.
พระอาทิตย์ไทยที่จะลงนามกับเซอร์จอห์น บาวริงผมคิดว่าต้องการที่จะให้เกิดความชัดเจนในเรื่องความสัมพันธ์มันมีกฎหมายมันมีกฎเกณฑ์
He says really it was the start of Thailand on on the world legal map. You have a formal, very formal treaty. It's given a real existence to Siam, and there's a legal framework. And that, to him, is the real start of modern history of Southeast Asia, because there was only one country in that situation at that point, that was Siam.
ผมคิดว่าพระปรีชาสามารถอยู่ตรงที่ว่าให้มีกฎเกณฑ์ที่ชัดเจนเป็นลายลักษณ์อักษร
So John Bowring, in his famous book, himself pays very serious acknowledgement of the cleverness of King Rama IV. They are the real special bond.
สัญญา Bowring จะถูกมองว่าทำให้สยามต้องเสียเปรียบอังกฤษในหลายด้านและมีผลทำให้ประเทศอื่นๆเข้ามาขอทำสัญญาในลักษณะเดียวกันโดยที่สยามไม่อาจปฏิเสธได้แต่ในอีกด้านหนึ่งการค้าระหว่างประเทศที่เสรีมากขึ้นก็ส่ง
One aspect where Siam may be lost because of that treaty is, you know, the how you call that, the extraterritoriality of all the foreigners had their own courts. This is Ajahn Sutipan Tilatiwat, member of the central family, but also a very well-known economist here. And so there was a negative aspect, that inequality, but at the same time, it was really the first frame of formal trade instead of the old-style traditional trade with neighboring countries. And it was the first, it led to multilateral trade.
Thailand became the rice hub of the region and also a really important part of the total region.
เจ้าพระยาที่พากรวงศ์ผู้แต่งพระราชพงศาวดาร
Here, in each episode, I try to use documents of that time. This is a traditional chronicle written under Rama IV, and saying once the treaty was signed, we fairly quickly, the volume of trade really increased. The number of things you had never seen before started to come to Bangkok. The number of ships, this is from the Bangkok Recorder, and there's another proof of what is being read from that chronicle. The number of ships, foreign ships that came to trade from Batavia, from Hong Kong, from Singapore, from Japan, increased tremendously within 3 or 4 years after the treaty. That had never been seen before.
เงินข้างนาก็ถึง 4,000 ช่าง 5,000 ช่างราษฎรมั่งมีเงินทองขึ้นทุกแห่ง
And people became richer.
หลังจากที่สยามเปิดเสรีทางการค้ามากขึ้นการส่งออกข้าวและไม้สักก็เพิ่มปริมาณขึ้นอย่างรวดเร็ว
The volume of trade increased very quickly. This is the years from 1857, the increase in the rise of rice.
Siam were forbidden. And, you know, the king issued, in fact, after the treaty was signed, a decree pointing out that, saying that, you know, as for allowing the export of rice, which would improve the price, which indeed it did. And of course, Siam was very soon exporting large quantities of rice, including to Hong Kong. I mean,
this is Hong Kong, of course.
You know, first markets.
แล้วก็ส่งออกเป็นรูปของข้าวกล้องที่ปนกับข้าวเปลือก
Thai academic, very good historian of economics, says that in the early years, there was no industrial rice mills here. So rice was exported as is, and it was, for example, milled in Liverpool. This place is in Liverpool, a Victorian era rice mill. And rice going to Europe in the early days, in the region was for human consumption, but in the rice that went to Europe was to make cheap alcohol, mostly. That's why we have people chanting and all that, because to illustrate cheap alcohol. Sometimes you don't know what images to put on things like that. But that's very old footage of people on the boat, so that's why it was kind of done.
ทางการค้าเพียงอย่างเดียวแต่ยังเป็นผลสืบเนื่องมาจากการปฏิวัติอุตสาหกรรม
And here I go back a little bit more on the background. The Industrial Revolution that started in Europe, the machinery And the reason why the treaty had so much impact is that a few years after the treaty, a bit over 10 years after the treaty, you had the Suez Canal. So it's really a chain of events. You have the treaty that opens the things legally. You have the steamboat that start to replace the old ships. And you have the canal that cuts the time in traveling from Europe to Asia.
ได้สูบงอมค่อนข้างชัดเจนก็คือหลังจากที่อังกฤษสามารถทำสงครามชนะฝรั่งเศส
And this historian is explaining that another reason is that once basically UK lost America because of the independence war and then won over France in Europe, UK became that big power and needed to expand, needed raw materials, and that's really
น่าจะมีเป็นผลมาจากการที่อังกฤษได้สูญเสียสหรัฐอเมริกาไป
and that led the UK to come more and more to Asia after those things
อังกฤษจะมาแถวตะวันออกไปถึงออสเตรเลียไปถึงนิวซีแลนด์
การเปิดสนธิญาบาวริงเปิดเสรีทางการค้ามีคนจีนอพยพเนี่ยทำให้
At the same time because the economy was developing you had all that Chinese migration coming here
อย่างมากซึ่งก็เป็นฐานของเศรษฐกิจเป็นฐานการตั้งต้นเศรษฐกิจของไทยอีกอันหนึ่งที่
and the Chinese provided two things to the Thai economy the laborer workers that built a lot of things were Chinese there was not enough population in Thailand already back then and the traders so that's why the Chinese became such an important part of the Thai economy to this day
ทำงานเต็มเวลาซึ่งก่อนหน้านั้นคนไทยเป็นไม่ได้
there was no
เป็นทาส
Yeah, they were slaves, but there were no workers in the modern sense until the Chinese workers came.
ยกเว้นค้าขายกับกรรมกรคนจีนก็เดินทางไปตั้งร้านค้าอยู่ทั่วทุกหัวแห่งที่มี
And the Chinese started to spread over all the provinces of Thailand, and that's the base of the modern economy in many ways.
อำเภอทุกตำบลในสยามอันนี้เป็นฐานเศรษฐกิจที่เป็นอยู่ในปัจจุบันสืบเนื่องมาจนถึงปัจจุบัน
ชาวจีนที่มีเงินทุนเข้ามาประกอบกิจการโรงสีข้าวและค้าข้าวรวมถึงการค้าขาย
the rice mills initially were outside of Thailand the first rice mills in Thailand were built by Westerners and then slowly the Chinese migrants took over the rice mills and the rice trade
ยิ่งไปกว่านั้นการเปิดคลองสุเอซ
And here what I told you earlier this is an old map about the opening of the Suez Canal and how this suddenly created new sea routes that boosted trade with Europe.
จากที่มีการเปิดสัญญาบาวริงระหว่างไทยกับอังกฤษแล้วเนี่ยมันก็มีความเปลี่ยนแปลงทางเศรษฐกิจอย่างมากมายนะครับในเอเชียด้วยเหตุหลายประการซึ่งคล้ายคลึงกับปัจจุบันนั่นแหละมีการพัฒนาระบบการขนส่ง
So here is giving more details about the Suez Canal, the improvement in transportation.
แล้วก็สิ้นสุดในปี 1869 ที่เปิดใช้
The Suez Canal was opened in 1869.
เปิดเรื่องการสื่อสารสมัยใหม่ก็คือการมีโทรเลข
And then telegraph came
ที่คอนกรีตเปิดใช้นั่นแหละ
and changed communication in a major way, like the internet nowadays.
ก็ได้เริ่มเปิดใช้ในช่วงไล่เลี่ยกันนี้นะครับเมื่อมีการสื่อสารที่มีประสิทธิภาพข่าวสารข้อมูลจากยุโรปสามารถส่งมาสู่เอเชียได้ภายในเวลาเพียงแค่ไม่เกินครึ่งชั่วโมงก่อนหน้านี้ต้องใช้เวลาเป็นอาทิตย์
The time it took to send news between Europe and Asia with telegraph was shortened to in terms of hours instead of weeks. And another thing that helped to boost the trade was liberalization of trade by friends of Sir John Bowring, basically in the UK, the famous Corn Laws. This is a picture I took in 1978 of the old house, tax house next to the Oriental. Here I talk about the role of Chinese traders who became agents of tax collection agents. That's one thing also that boosted the Chinese role in business. The state gave concessions. And here the voice is a chronicle saying suddenly there were lots of taxes, playing shows and all sorts of trade had to pay taxes. There was taxes on fishing, on everything.
พายโกลนพริกไทย
ตอนสนธิญาเบาริงมาเนี่ยก็ได้มีการเปิดประตูเกี่ยวกับเรื่องการค้าว่าประชาชนสามารถที่จะค้าขายต่างประเทศได้
And private people started to be able to trade with foreigners when, until the Bowring Treaty, rice trade was forbidden, and only the state, the ministry in charge, could trade with foreigners. And so people started to make money from trading. This is Kun Narongchai, former commerce minister and a former academic at Thammasat.
อารยธรรมตะวันตกมีผลกระทบอย่างมากต่อวงราชการสยามในสมัยรัชกาลที่ 4 กฎหมายตราสามดวงที่เคยใช้อยู่
And the legal changes followed internal laws, the old Kotmai Tra Samduang, the old traditional Thai laws, started to not fit with the times.
Do the right thing? Well, within the context of which he was operating, yes, he did. He managed to negotiate a treaty which, gave Siam equal status, even if there were, these unequal aspects of the treaty with extraterritoriality and so on. But as I say, extraterritoriality wasn't really an issue in the discussions. I mean, the issue in the discussions was all sort of trade access and ability to, freeing rice exports.
กลุ่มพ่อค้าต่างชาติเดินทางเข้ามาสยามมากขึ้น
And yeah, so more and more foreign businessmen start to establish, and we are going to give some examples. And I mean, there were areas of Bangkok where foreigners were allowed to settle, and it was the Westerners and people under their domination. So, for example, Singaporean traders, Hokkien and Peranakan traders came around Ceylon as dependent of British Empire. And then Bangkok started to develop. People say the Bowring Treaty is a treaty which changed the face of Bangkok. Modern roads started to be built. Taran Krung, Rama 4, and many other roads after that. Under Rama the 5th, 110 roads were built in Bangkok. Under Rama the 4th, 20 or something. And this is Kun Navaporn, former central banker and historian of the economy. And she has done many books about those Peranakan, the Chinese, Singaporean Chinese, who came to play a big role as compradors and traders. And so which sometimes are called the Baba and the Yayas, Peranakan culture. For example, this fellow who was a cashier at the East Asiatic was a Peranakan.
เพื่อทำงานกับบริษัทต่างชาติอย่างเช่นในบริษัทดิแทมอีสเอเชียติกอะไรพวกนี้นะคะและบริษัทเหล่านี้เนี่ยสำนักงานก็อยู่ริมแม่น้ำเจ้าพระยาเพราะสมัยก่อนการเดินทางเนี่ยหรือว่าการส่งสินค้าเนี่ยก็ขึ้นบกฝั่งริมแม่น้ำเจ้าพระยา
การเข้ามาตั้งถิ่นฐานของกลุ่มพ่อค้าต่างชาติมีส่วนช่วยให้เกิดการเปลี่ยนแปลงทั้งทางด้านกฎหมายและการพัฒนาโครงสร้างพื้นฐานของสยามในระยะต่อมาเมื่อพระบาทสมเด็จพระจุลจอมเกล้าเจ้าอยู่หัวรัชกาลที่ 5
the changes that came, the infrastructure changes that came, ultimately led under Rama V to the big reform of Thai government, creation of modern ministries, and so. But before those changes happened, Rama V, since very young, he was 16, I think, on the first trip he made first trip ever to a foreign country by a Siamese king was to Singapore, where you can still see this monument celebrating that visit in 1871, the first foreign visit by a Thai king. And so he went to study, to see what the British were doing in Singapore and India, and came back to modernize administration here. And so Ajahn Sompop here is explaining how that led to the modernization of the organization of Thailand's government services. So ministries was established. Ministers in the early days were all princes who had been sent overseas mostly to study. And there were a lot of foreigners still as advisors. For example, this gentleman, the German, was the advisor for all the post office, telegraph, and everything. And trying to modernize Siam to be equal to foreign countries. Then you had the first tramway, I mean rail, but it was a tramway basically between the old city and the port. And then the first rail train going to Ayutthaya, which was the start of the expansion to other provinces. All this happened under Rama V. And then there was the canals in Rangsit, a major thing, a major project, the mega project of the days. Harald Ling will describe it very well in a short time.
He thought that they want to develop the rice cultivating area closer to Bangkok in a big way. So he gave a concession to a princely family, the Snitwong family, and they asked Ikrim, Mr. Müller, the founder, to join. Mr. Müller at that time suggested to bring in machinery from Germany, so then make the digging more professional. And so they dug the biggest irrigation system in Southeast Asia, or maybe in Asia of that time, 1,500 kilometers of canals, and nowadays it's so well known. And at that time it was all bush and jungle.
นอกจากการพัฒนาเส้นทางรถไฟและการขุดคลองแล้วในยุคสมัยนี้ยังได้มีการก่อตั้งกิจการสาธารณูปโภคและโครงสร้างพื้นฐานต่างๆ
So you had the canals, the trains, and all the other infrastructure.
เช่นรัชกาลที่ 5
The schools, modern schools started to be established. So in Kulab, in the palace first, and now it's one of the top schools in Thailand. This is the actual building. The hospitals, Silirat Hospital was established. So the entire infrastructure, modern infrastructure of what you would expect a modern country to have, started to take shape.
โดยเฉพาะในราชวงศ์จักรีเนี่ยส่วนใหญ่หรือเกือบจะเรียกว่าทุกพระองค์เนี่ยมองถึงทุกสุขของประชาชน
This is Prime Minister Anand talking about the role of the monarchs in those days in really being the spearheading developments and new initiatives.
แม้แต่รัชกาลที่ 7 รัชกาลที่ 6 รัชกาลที่ 5 หรือแม้แต่รัชกาลที่ 4 ก็จะมองเห็นความสำคัญของประชาชน
and focusing on what they need to improve life in their country and for their people.
มีปัจจัยที่ช่วยเร่งพัฒนาเศรษฐกิจให้รุดหน้าเช่นกิจการไปรษณีย์สยาม
This is images I took in the beautiful post office museum in Chiang Mai. If you go to Chiang Mai, I highly recommend. I just have a few images, but there are great things to see there. Great museum.
ยาวไปถึงสันดอนปากแม่น้ำเจ้าพระยารวมระยะทางทั้งสิ้น
And the telegraph was really important because first it shortened the communication between Europe and the rest of the world and Siam itself. But this historian is explaining us that when a boat was arriving in the port, you could very quickly inform downtown that, oh, ship name XYZ is here, or if there was any military risk when the French did funny things in the Chao Phraya, for example, the information could suddenly be much faster than it used to be. This is telegraph also in that museum. And telegraph had been introduced very early, but shown to the king first, and then it became a system around the city and established. And here is describing how it was used for the incoming ships. It was related, I mean, knowing ships come relates to tax collection and all that, so it was very important for the economy or for security issues.
Having access to the internet, difficult to imagine what a revolution telegraph was. Because before, you needed a letter, it took 6 weeks to come from Germany to Thailand. And now suddenly, within a few hours, you can get the information from over 9,000 kilometers.
การพัฒนาด้านพลังงานเป็นอีกปัจจัยสำคัญที่ช่วยให้เศรษฐกิจ
Development of energy came. The first, this is the fireworks team of the first electricity production company, and that's the office of the first, the Siam Electricity Co. And the Danish guy who set up that company was also one of the early initiators of the tram system. And those are beautiful images of the tram in those days. This is the Thai prince who was one of the initiators of testing electricity in Bangkok. And I long wanted to know what was the first building illuminated by electricity in Bangkok. And I got the answer, the defense ministry. If you go to China, in Shanghai, there's a hotel called nowadays a hotel that says it's the first place where electricity was used in China. So I wanted to know what was it in Thailand. I know now, it's the defense ministry. This is the first finance ministry that is now part of the palace, in the compound of the palace.
absolute monarchy ที่มีพระราชอำนาจเพราะฉะนั้นก็ตอนนั้นไม่จำเป็นต้องมี financial independence ส่วน
Here it's Dr. Tirayu, the director of the Crown Property Bureau, explaining under the absolute monarchy, of course, there was no need for modern finance management because it was absolute monarchy. But he was told by the man we saw briefly in the black and white picture, a very important prince, how the king really was keeping the money next to his bed, you know, initially in the old days. But because of modernization, of course, under Rama V, things changed. I mean, he's saying more than that, but sorry, I do a summary translation.
บอกว่าส่วนใหญ่ได้มาจากการค้าขายเรือสำเภาสมัยนั้นนะฮะแล้วก็ส่วนหนึ่งได้มาจากภาษีกรด้วยเป็นส่วนหนึ่งไม่ใช่ทั้งหมดที่มาจากภาษีกรก็มาเก็บเอาไว้
Money in the royal treasure was coming from the trade and from taxes.
ก็แปลกเหมือนกันคือมันขัดกับเหตุผลปกติธรรมดา
And Rama IV was very careful in spending, so he accumulated a lot of money under Rama IV because he was a monk for so long, he was not very keen on spending. That's what he's saying.
ท่านก็เก็บเอาไว้
พุทธศักราช 2439 มีการจัดทำงบประมาณแผ่นดินขึ้นเป็นครั้งแรก
This is in the early years of having a modern style budget, you know, spending and revenues, you know. This is the Thai who wrote the first economics books in Thai, and he was an early finance minister. And this is the Bangkok era years, the bottom line, and it's the increase in the volume of trade. Tax revenue, but that's from trade. And then there was modernization of the money, you know, from the old style money to modern coins. That was what was used before the modern coins. Pot duong. Very nice pieces of work, but you don't want to have too many in your pockets because your pants would not stand that. And that's the very early banknotes. The early banknotes actually were produced by the foreign banks, like in Hong Kong. You know, when you go to Hong Kong, you see Standard Chartered or Hong Kong banknotes. Thailand, the first banknotes were also by those two banks, but then the government started to print its own. And then there was a change of
ระหว่างเงินสยามและเงินสกุลต่างประเทศให้มั่นคงด้วยเมื่อเศรษฐกิจการค้าของสยามพัฒนาไปความต้องการบริการด้านการเงินและการธนาคาร
And so the need for banking started to rise.
ธนาคารแห่งแรกที่
The first bank was Hong Kong Shanghai Bank in 1888.
Banking Corporation ในพุทธศักราช 2431
and closely followed by Standard Chartered and the French bank, Indochine Bank, later known as Indosuez. This is คุณหญิงชดา former CEO of Siam Commercial Bank.
ส่วนใหญ่ก็ได้ทำหน้าที่ที่จะทั้งช่วยในเรื่องของธุรกิจและการเงินในธุรกิจที่เกี่ยวข้องกับการนำเข้าส่งออกนะคะ
And so the early days the banks were really all about the trade.
สำคัญสมัยนู้นก็คงต้องเป็นข้าวและก็เป็นไม้สักเป็นหลักนะคะแต่ว่าเมื่อทำธุรกิจกับทางด้านภาคต่างประเทศแล้วธนาคารพาณิชย์เหล่านั้นก็ได้ให้บริการกับทั้งธุรกิจและบุคคลในประเทศไทย
from that purely trade financing, basically the banks were doing initially, they started to expand activities. But it was all foreign banks initially.
Banks basically started as foreign trade banks, right, who were involved mostly in foreign exchange, sterling in those days, maybe the French franc, and a little bit of the US dollar. But it was all about trade.
เมื่อธนาคารในประเทศอังกฤษกับของฝรั่งเศสตั้งขึ้นมาเป็นสาขาในประเทศไทยเนี่ย
And here she's telling about the comprador I was telling back then earlier a bit mentioned. Those foreign bankers, initially the banking was done by those French and British bankers, and they came here, but they did not know the market. So you had all those Chinese traders who became compradors and were really the key man between the foreign bankers and the local clients. Those are some of the very famous compradors of those days.
รัชกาลที่5ทรงตั้งพระทัยอย่างแน่วแน่
And King Rama V became aware of the fact that there was a problem there, that the finance was in the hands of foreigners, and this prince, Maisara Raja Ritai, studied what should be done. And so initially there were various plans. I don't go in all the details. There was the first idea to set up a central bank, but finally he decided that no, we first need to establish a commercial bank. And initially, not to raise worries about the foreigners, they call it book club. But instead of lending and borrowing books, it was about money. But they call it book club to say, so the foreign bankers would not be worried that competition was coming. And this is a citation from the prince who created the first bank, saying, if the finances are in the hands of foreigners, it can be very dangerous, in short, for national security. So we need to do something, basically. We have soldiers, so we need our own banking to defend the country as much as we need soldiers. And to protect us from the French and the British. So that's the statue of the same prince at the Banking Museum. That's the place where the first book club was established. And then it became Siam Commercial Bank, as it's known today. There were a few changes of name in either Thai or English along the way, but it's still the same bank now for 111 years. And so he quit from finance minister to become the founder of the bank, because he was afraid that if he remained finance minister, the Westerners would complain that would be unfair to be both a competitor and a minister. This is a bad guy in Thai history. It's the French admiral for the Indochina fleet, which came to threaten Bangkok. So I was talking about the risk from colonization still around.
คิดว่าทำไมประเทศไทยถึงจะมีสิ่งอำนวยความสะดวกเช่นนี้นะคะที่เป็นของคนไทยได้บ้าง
So here we had voice over explaining what happened, and here it's documents and Kunikshada, the former CEO of Siam Commercial Bank, explaining
ท่านได้สั่งตำรามาจาก
how he learned.
นะคะมาดูว่าวิธีการลงบัญชี
started by ordering
วิธีการให้
banking
วิธี
textbooks
รับ
from
ฝาก
Europe
เงิน
to study how
ทำอย่างไรนะคะ
how banks should work, and
กำหนด
studied
วิธีการ
carefully,
อย่าลืม
and
ว่าตอนนั้น
finally
ท่านผู้ชมอา
came
ยุ
with
ประ
the
มาณ
book club,
30
and
กว่า
then
เท่านั้น
finally with
ท่า
the
นก็
bank.
ได้ร่วม
So
กับ
and then
คนอีก 18 คนนะคะที่จะเริ่ม
so there
ก่อ
were
ตั้ง
altogether
สิ่ง
90
ที่ท่า
people
นเรีย
who
กว่า
together created
book club
the book
นะ
club.
คะซึ่งถือว่าเป็นแหล่งที่ทั้งรับฝากไม่ใช่หนังสือแต่เป็นเงินแล้วก็ให้ยืมก็เช่นเดียวกันไม่ใช่หนังสือแต่เป็นเงินนะคะแต่ว่าให้ชื่อว่าบุ๊กคลับไว้ก่อนนะคะเพื่อดูว่ากิจการแบบนี้เนี่ยจะไปได้หรือไม่นะคะเป็นที่น่าสังเกตว่าที่จริงหลักของท่านเนี่ยณวันนั้นก็คือว่าน่าจะเป็นเรื่องที่ไม่ยากนักที่จะให้ยืม
The main thing was not
แต่
really
สิ่งที่จะยากกว่าเนี่ยก็
to
คือการ
land,
รับฝากเงิน
but to convince people that they could have confidence in the institution and they would dare to put their deposit in the bank.
ที่จริงนั่นคือหลักการสำ
And
คัญ
from that day to
ของธนา
today,
คาร
that's the
ใด
key in
ๆ
banking.
ไม่ว่า
You
จะ
need
วันนู้น
to
100 ปีมาแล้วหรือวันนี้นะคะก็คือว่าจะต้องมีชื่อเสียงจะต้องมีทุนรอนที่หนุนกิจการที่เพียงพอ
จากการที่สยามเปิดเสรีทางการค้ามากขึ้นและเศรษฐกิจขยายตัวอย่างต่อเนื่องทำให้มีชาวยุโรปและอเมริกันรวมถึงคนในบังคับอังกฤษต่างอพยพเข้ามาตั้งถิ่นฐานในกรุงเทพกันมากขึ้นบางก็ทำงานกับบริษัทการค้าขนาดใหญ่บางก็ตั้งธุรกิจของตัวเองในขณะที่บางคนก็เข้ารับราชการเป็นที่ปรึกษาในสาขาต่างๆ
And you had Westerners helping to set up the local judicial system too.
ที่มีความรู้ความเชี่ยวชาญอย่างเช่นด้านวิศวกรรมกฎหมายสาธารณสุขและ
the first doctors, the first teachers of medicine at Thailand, obviously.
อย่างยั่งยืนจวบจนปัจจุบัน
The first medicine factory, drug factories.
มาจากออสเตรียและเยอรมนี
And so I focus on Big Green really because of one thing. They will soon be 140 years, and they are basically the last standing big European companies set up by European family and still here
modern medicine
under
factory
European control.
in Thailand, which was a Siam dispensary, was very well known, and Big Green got the appointment to the royal court quite immediately because we supplied very helpful medicines, and then we imported all kinds of equipment.
หลังสนธิสัญญาบาวริงสยามได้เจริญสัมพันธไมตรีกับต่างประเทศ
So not only the foreigners were coming, but we started to have more and more trips by the royal families and the kings to Europe. Here I have some images of trips by King Rama V. There was the moving images in Switzerland. And here you have Russia, before you have France and Sweden. And so Dr. Surin says, really that's the time where Siam established its network, its position as a diplomatic player that matters. Showing is independent, being an independent state, having its own diplomatic corps. Having people in all the big cities where you need to be to play a role. And still there was always that fear of the French and the British. So to deal with the French and the British in key positions, many of the advisors were Europeans, but anything but French or British. So Belgians, Danish, name it, as they were not French or British. So the Belgium gentleman we just saw, Roland Jacquemin, was very keen in establishing the legal system here. He became he got a royal title, พระอภัยราชา
ชาวเบลเยียมหรือเจ้าพระยาอภัยราชาสยามานุกูลกิจแล้วยังมีชาวต่างชาติอีกไม่น้อยที่เข้ามารับราชการจนประสบความสำเร็จอย่างสูงในประเทศสยามหนึ่งในนั้นคือ
A very interesting case is Tilike. You probably know Tilike and Gibbons to this day. This gentleman was from Sri Lanka, so he came here as a British dependent, right? and he made a name for himself by defending a Thai officer who had killed a French officer during a border issue with the French. And so he became very close to the kings, both Rama V and Rama VI, and ended up being Attorney General and being a key drafter of many of the big important laws initially. And also he established Chilike and Gibbons.
As a sole practitioner, and got his start really when he defended a Thai military officer, was accused of murdering a French military officer. At the time, there was a series of international or consular courts here, which were set up by the various foreign countries under the treaties. Among other things, Thailand was trying to bring its legal system in line with a Western legal system in order to placate these European powers. Chilike assisted in drafting some of the basic laws, which were a lot of basic laws here, essentially the Civil and Commercial Code, which Chilike helped with, the Penal Code, the Civil Procedure Code, and the Criminal Procedure Code. These all came about in the late 19th century, early 20th century.
ชาวต่างชาติอีกท่านหนึ่งที่มีคุณูปการช่วยให้สยามพัฒนาระบบชลประทาน
Another very important man was the Dutch engineers who came to develop the irrigation system. And the page before from the Siam Society Journal in 1906 is considered as the first article of economic history about Thailand. There was a book recently about him.
สร้างเขื่อนขนาดใหญ่เพื่อทดน้ำในแม่น้ำเจ้าพระยาตรงจังหวัดชัยนาท
And he planned this dam back in the early 1900s, and the dam was finally built 40 or 50 years later with money from the World Bank in 1950s.
With monarchy, of course, all the ministries were under His Majesty the King, and nowadays everybody knows that King Rama IV and King Rama V, they really put a strong effort in developing Thailand to become part of the international communities and develop infrastructure really strongly, develop the medical system, the health infrastructure really strongly. And I think we still benefit from that today because the mindset was set at that time.
การเร่งพัฒนาด้านต่างๆพร้อมๆกันจำเป็นต้องใช้เงิน
This is Thailand's first bond issue on the global market. It was issued in Paris and in London in sterling, of course, 1905. And this is, I have a copy in my private collection of economic history documents. Very nice piece of printing work, actually.
ด้วยการออกพันธบัตรเป็นครั้งแรกเมื่อพุทธศักราช 2448 โดยออกจำหน่ายในตลาดเงินลอนดอนและปารีสจำนวน 1 ล้านปอนด์
1 million pounds back then, mostly to finance the construction of the train network.
รวมทั้งช่วยเหลือเงินคงคลังและทำนุบำรุงประเทศ
4.5% interest.
Between 1856 and say, the death of King Chulalongkorn. I mean, it's just astonishing in terms of the population, the economic output, the development of education, of railways, and all these things.
อีกเหตุการณ์ที่น่าสนใจคือ
Another thing of interest is that very early Siam started to project itself to the world. Those are old images from participation to World Expos. The first one was in 1862 in London and then Paris and all that. But the really beautiful one was in Turin, Italy in 1911. And the last few shots would be about that. And there is video. I bought the rights from Italy to use that video, which is absolutely stunning, of the pavilion, the Siamese pavilion in Turin 1911. The Thai pavilion is coming. 1,000 square meters pavilion, this one. And the final painting will be also of that thing, and that's the inside of the pavilion. So very early thinking about projecting yourself to the world. So really globalization. This is a beautiful painting of the same pavilion once finished. As Thailand wanted to be on the world stage, very, very proudly. So That's the credits. So I thought of doing this film over 5 years from the day of the floods, 18 months of production, and it took about 30 people to help me either full-time or part-time to make it happen. So that's just episode 1. The other 4 episodes, the second one goes from World War I, another very key period, to 1957, and then 57, the start of the arrival of the World Bank, to the mid-80s, then mid-80s to today, and the 5th episode about the future.
Right, well, as usual, we have a microphone in the middle of the room, so if you'd like to ask a question, come up and do it. Whilst people are marshalling themselves, what has been the response to this? It's been screened already.
It was shown on 2 Thai TV channels already. The premiere was on Thai PBS. They have a time for documentaries they produce themselves or they produce by other people every Saturday evening. And so it was, I mean, traditional TV, as you know, globally and especially in Thailand, the ratings are down. But there is an estimated 600,000 viewers of documentary in Thailand. That's the TV industry numbers. And because first time we showed on Thai PBS, then we had it on Pluk Panya, the educational channel of True, and third channel is, I don't want to name it because they were supposed to confirm the dates today, they have not. But the third channel has to show it as well. I think we should have reached a big share, but well, we didn't compete with soap operas, obviously.
And is there any international interest in this?
To be frank, when I did the project, we asked the sponsor, should we do an English version? And they really wanted to do that as an educational project for Thai viewers. So there's been a lot of interest from schools. We had a lot of schools asking, when can we show it to our students? University professors told me, I will show it as a crash course in economic history to my students and all that. But once I finished that, so 5 years in my brain in the making, 18 months of production, I was both relieved, exhausted, and close to despair. What is my purpose in life from now on, you know? So if somebody has to do the English version, I would do it, but I would rather do something else because I don't want to go through it again. I would rather have somebody else doing the translation.
But it should be fairly straightforward. I mean, you should be able to sign.
Yeah, actually, there have been people saying, "Oh, we should show it to the." I mean, Chinese are big character all along the story. Obviously, Japan as well in the modern days. A lot of people say, "Oh, we should do a." I say, "Yes, okay." I'm open. I mean, this is not for sale anymore. It will be soon after the next channel. It will go free on YouTube. And the agreement with the sponsor is that from now on it's free. It's a Vitayatan, if I may say, as we say in Thai. So if anyone wants to do a faithful translation, I'm ready to agree. But I don't feel like doing it myself.
Right. So, as I said, there's a microphone there if you want to ask questions. When you talk about Siam in the mid-19th century, it sounds as if it's the same place as it is now, and you talk about all the borders, and in fact, it was quite different, wasn't it?
Yeah, you're right to point that I only talk about the border issue when I talk about the Bowring Treaty, and we have Dr. Surin explaining how mapping was basically a Western invention, I mean, modern mapping. I did not go through all the changes of border throughout the period because simply, I mean, once you do a documentary, I'm sure there are other documentary makers here, you need to have a storyline. And there are probably 5,000 facts more I wanted to put in any of the episodes, but once you choose a storyline, you have to stick to it. So I talk as little as possible of politics, as they say in the US, it's the economy stupid, so I stuck to the economy. Try to mention politics only when required, and things like the borders, yes. I had to stick to kind of a big image of Thailand because simply could not fit everything.
Right, question.
I just wonder if you may have some comments about the current situation for Thailand and its participation in the global economy, and any predictions for the future, any advice?
I mean, the fifth episode was a very interesting experience. Before I answer, just briefly, so initially I'd planned 4 episodes, but then talking to people, hey, maybe we should look at the future, exactly your question, you know. But what am I going to write about the future? I'm not in the forecast business, you know, I'm in the video business. So I did not write a script for 5th episode. I wrote questions and asked all the 21 people I interviewed the same questions. What are your hopes, fears, you know, forecast, anything, whatever you want to say about the next 20 years, please tell me. And then instead of writing something and starting from there, I went back listening to those hours and hours of interviews. That was excruciatingly painful as much as it was rewarding. And I tried to just take their comments. And if you look at the future, I guess topic number 1 is everybody says that. It seems very simple. I did not invent anything new, but everybody says it's really a matter of education. The way economy is changing so fast, we are doing very well in a few areas. I mean, who could have imagined first day I came here that Thailand would be one of the world top 10 car exporters? But suddenly you have electric cars coming in. Can Thailand make the transition to electric cars? Thailand is big in this or that. Can it? Hard disk are kind of passé already. Are we in the SSD markets? You know, you have all those things. There's only one thing I truly believe. The continuity line through all this is, it sounds like PR, but it's not. It's talking to all those people. It's one thing I believe. I'm not talking to businessmen, but talking to economists like Amma or whatever. Thailand's agricultural and food business is really strong. Some people may like or may not like some companies. That's a different issue. But Thailand, look at the FAO map of the world, and they have a beautiful map they do once in a while of who are the countries that need the world to survive, and those producing the food to those who don't have it. And you have a super dark green Thailand. Dark green meaning you produce a lot more than you consume. And Thailand is really feeding a huge share of the world. And that's something, as the population of the world grows, that will not go anywhere. The challenges of digital economy, artificial intelligence, fintech, name it. I don't think anybody has an answer. But if Thailand will continue to feed the world the next 40 years like it has done for the past 160 years, yes, I believe.
Oh, no.
We can see in the documentary that the role of the royal family and the aristocracy in the economy is very important for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
How and when came the involvement of the commoners, and is it linked to the migration of the Chinese?
And here, really, I try to have